Okay, we're now recording, so be careful what you say. Um, and if you want a copy of the recording, you can send us a request at our email address, graypanther-sf@sonic.net. If somebody could put that in the chat, I'd appreciate it. Email us at graypanther-sf@sonic.net if you want a recording of this meeting. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. James Taylor is an esteemed USF professor of political science, African American studies, critical diversity studies with a master's in public affairs and urban affairs, and is one of the 15 members of the SF Reparations Advisory Committee. He is the author of his book, Black Nationalism in the United States, From Malcolm X to Barack Obama. His areas of interest and understanding and explaining are explaining how race shapes political behavior, social movements, and public opinion. He has spoken to the SF Gray Panthers in the past, and we welcome him back. Again, if you're not a speaker or if you haven't raised your hand, please mute yourself. With that, I would like to give Dr. James Taylor the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll share my screen here now with everyone. And I want to say thank you to all of you for welcoming me back. I remember when I spoke last time, we had a great time together. And unfortunately, we still haven't been able to get into the same room. But at least we can, engage in this manner. Some of this, parts of it, what I gathered today, actually, some of it I shared in the past. It's the same topic. It's more or less, at the end of this is a sort of an update on what our own work has been in the city of San Francisco so far. And I'm really honored to be on a program with Tessa Boudin. When I saw that, I was excited. I was like, wow, that's really great to be able to associate my name with him. I remember when Jeff Adachi was still alive, Jeff Adachi was promoting his own film, The People's Lawyer, I believe it was, or The People's Defender. And there was a program where Jeff Adachi and I sat together, and I really cherished that as well. So I'll just go ahead and start, sort of asking us to sort of think about, what we're talking about and what we're engaging in at the state of California level and at the San Francisco city and county level. The whole idea of reparations, I'll talk about the sort of recent evolution of it in a moment. But I wanted to sort of outline early that it's really an original idea, especially in South Carolina and in Tennessee. Immediately at the end of the Civil War, General Sherman gathered a group of Black men in South Carolina and said, what is it that we can do for you? And by this point, thousands and thousands of people had already left the plantations and followed the Union Army everywhere. To the point where it's about 300,000 people, Du Bois estimates, abandoned the plantations and depriving them of labor. And immediately, the newly free persons or recently enslaved, here referring to themselves as ex-slaves, began to think about what it is that they wanted. And they were asked, what do you want? And they said, give us 40 acres and a mule. Well, just give us what is basic, 10 acres per family member of a family of 4, and we'll work the land. They had worked the land. They knew agriculture where they were in different parts of the South. And so that's what they wanted, was 40 acres and a mule. And that becomes a metaphor or a symbol, an organizing principle from the very beginning. Even Spike Lee, his production company is known as 40 Acres and a Mule, to try to keep alive this particular history that was sort of lost once the NAACP was formed in 1909. In fact, the gentleman in the picture to the left, Reverend Isaiah Dickerson, was one of the leaders of a movement in Tennessee, along with Callie House here. And he dies in 1909, the same year the NAACP is created. And I think that's very important, because it almost signals the baton being passed from this focus on economic impacts of slavery, and then it shifts to rights with the NAACP, to political rights. And so the question was, what was more important? Is it economic rights? Is it civil rights? It also echoes the debate that would emerge 20 years later between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington is making effectively an economic argument that Blacks should not focus on political equality, they should focus on economic development. Cast your buckets where you are. So from the very outset, there was this sort of division around what should be the priority for the newly freed persons. Obviously, it was about survival and sustenance. The Freedmen's Bureau emerged to try to give as much aid as they possibly could. And of course, with the Johnson administration's hostility, much of what was developed around the Reconstruction period was collapsed. Callie House is a forgotten American figure, but Mary Frances Berry, who many of you probably know already as a great civil rights lawyer, she was in the Clinton Civil Rights Division in the Federal Commission. Mary Frances Berry, the author of My Face is Black is True. This is the evidence here that the first focus of African Americans after abolition and the Underground Railroad was reparations. It's gotten lost in the movement from 1909 until Martin Luther King. From 1909 to 1965, integration takes over the focus and it becomes more about political rights, political rights. And so the very idea of economic rights was always present, but marginalized. And even, Martin Luther King toward the end began to make economic critiques more privately than publicly, because with Stanley Levinson by his side, he was constantly accused of being a communist. So King played down his economic critiques. But even if you listen to I Have a Dream, and most people don't hear this when he gives this speech, when he first starts talking, King says, we have come here and we have been given a check and it's been marked insufficient funds. That's what King says in the I Have a Dream preamble before he builds up to his crescendo. He says, we've come here to cash a check and it's been marked insufficient funds. And there are several other clips online that you can find on YouTube. Just Google or YouTube Martin Luther King and reparations, and you'll see about 4 or 5 different clips from different angles, more or less, where King explains how the European peasants in the 1880s and even before were given a basic floor, economic floor from which to build on. And King details how they were given land and land grants. And he says they were given land and technology and experts to help them mechanize the farms. And King then at the end of his clip says, and these are the very same people that tells the Negro to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. And King acknowledges in these clips the stigma of race and complexion itself in a society such as the United States, right, dominated by one major group. All of those minority groups have to deal with those proximities, right, whether or not they are more or less assimilable. Asians like Japanese, Chinese, African Americans, Africans were always seen as less assimilable than, say, and Native Americans especially were seen as unassimilable, both physically and culturally. And those that were seen as more assimilable were more or less accepted, right? And so what is happening here at the very beginning is that before Blacks make a demand for integration at all in 1909, and again, it's not them, it's the NAACP, and most of its founders were radical whites. They were radical socialists and progressives, religious individuals. You can Google the founders of the NAACP. Most of them were white radicals. And yet they rose to oppose Booker Washington, who basically said Blacks and whites should be as united as the fist when it comes to capitalist economic development, but separate as the five fingers when it comes to social life. And of course, he's in 1895's Alabama, so don't judge him too harshly. He's sort of making lemon out of the lemonades he's given Booker Washington, and that's why it's called accommodationism. But it was really pragmatism. Before Booker Washington, there was Callie House, and the movement really was led by ordinary people. Neither of these two individuals were the leaders of this movement. If you read Berry's book, you'll see that what really happened was it was just a massive movement of Blacks in Tennessee, over 200,000, who were already organized in a ordinary common sense movement that reparations in relationship to the mutual relief pension fund of the UN of the Union soldiers was entitled. They were entitled to it as well. So Callie House, in the 1890s, sues the U.S. Treasury for $63 million, and she measured it by a tax that was placed on cotton, punishing the Confederacy for about 9 years. And so she calculated the math of the tax that was placed on Confederate cotton. And since they labored it, they felt like they should get the money for it. And that was the impetus for the first idea about reparations. So I want to be clear. What I'm saying is, first, when Blacks were asked what they wanted immediately after the Civil War in South Carolina, they said 40 acres and a mule. When they organized their first massive movement, it was not for integration, nor was it for going back to Africa. It was for figuring out another way of being in America with resources and providing an economic foundation. And Callie House and Isaiah Washington were both arrested by the federal government. The post office prosecuted her for what they claimed to be mail fraud with no evidence, and they didn't have to prove any. And just so you understand, Callie House, the same method that they used on her over mail fraud is exactly what the federal government used against Marcus Garvey in the 1920s when they deported Garvey. But they did it to Callie House first, and most people don't know that. They tested it on her. She couldn't be deported. Garvey was deported after Calvin Coolidge pardoned him. But my point is, the federal government used the same approach of accusing them of raising money through mails, and they forbade the two of them from raising money through mails, and that's what they prosecuted them on. Washington dies in 1909. Callie House becomes a major leader. Again, her movement was larger than King's on a regular basis. A massive, a Memphis movement of Blacks that she and he joined and then became the spokespeople of, but they were not the creators of it. So it was kind of an organic reaction in the community, and these people became the propagandists of it. Here is some of the details of it. Let's see here. I can't see my whole page because let's see how I can do that. Okay, there we go. Okay. And again, here it notes that while slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, House and Dickinson traveled to slave states to gather support for the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. The RMB and PA is how it was known. The push for ex-slave pension gained momentum through this organization in 1897. It had two main goals: petition Congress for a bill that would grant compensation or reparations for enslaved persons, and to provide mutual aid and burial expenses. By the late 1890s, this organization became a leading grassroots organization for ex-slave pensions with membership in the hundreds of thousands. The pension bill submitted to Congress was not taken seriously, and the committee called for it to be indefinitely postponed. So that was Congress's reaction. Upon hearing this, Callie House reminded the commissioner that the Constitution of the U.S. grants citizens a right to petition for redress. She actually sued as well in 1915. The case is Johnson v. McAdoo, and it went to the Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court have ruled, the District Court of D.C. the Court of Appeals of the District of DC and the Supreme Court both ruled against reparations, suggesting that the government had immunity. So the government is immune for its crimes against the people in the United States. Of course, this can't stand up in international law, but that's what the court argued at that time. In 1915, the association filed in this case, and this is where they sued for $68 million, and they calculated it being the amount of taxes collected between 62 and 68 on cotton. And so this is, they're thinking through, what makes sense under the conditions that they find themselves, and how they were related to the wealth of, let's say, for example, in this case of the Johnson versus McAdoo case, that's where they become attached and find themselves as parties to the case and having standing to make claims for reparations. And this was the first documented Black reparations litigation in the US on the federal level. Johnson versus McAdoo. She gets arrested, there's a trial, she's in prison for 1 year. All white, all male jury imprisoned her for 1 year, and she did her time in Jefferson City, Missouri. Her arrest largely killed the movement. So that's the sort of foundation of reparations. It wasn't a radical idea, but the government responded to it as if it was a Black power demand, when it was really people trying to use what was available, the Union Soldiers Pension Fund, based on the cotton tax. And again, they felt that because they picked the cotton, that they should be their labor should make them the beneficiaries of it, since it was going to soldiers who were fighting for a 4-year war. And to be clear, Callie House also attached the idea that this claim was for their ancestors too, and not just for themselves who were alive and injured at that time in slavery, but like today's situation, they were making claims about what happened to their ancestors as part of the contemporary demand or claims around reparations. At the intervening period between, say, the 30s and the 1960s, World War II, the Great Depression's effects largely disorient the data from this time period. So people like Callie House get lost in history. She gets lost between, say, a Booker Washington and a Garvey and a King. Someone like Callie House or even Mary Ellen Pleasant, their stories don't get told as commonly, and yet the roles that they play in their niche situations were every bit as significant. Mary Ellen Pleasant was every bit as important as Harriet Tubman, and probably more concretely impactful for what she actually did compared to what Harriet Tubman came to represent as a symbolic figure. So I want to be clear. Here is a statement from Carter G. Woodson at the top of this page. The founder of Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, author of the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. He's talking about the manumitted slaves, and he's talking about in the 1860s, the poverty which afflicted them from a generation after emancipation. So that would be the 1880s, 1890s, held them down to the lowest order of society, nominally free, but economically enslaved. And the ripple effects of that. My grandfather is born in 1895. My mother's born 1925. So my grandfather's grandparents were slaves. And I was 5 in my room with my grandfather before he died. So I was in a room with a man whose grandparents were slaves. Her name was Phyllis Perrette. And yet that has no impact on me as a person. As some people imagine, they talk about how long ago slavery was, but they don't talk about how long it was. And as we speak, it would take another 100 years from 2023 up until about 2050 for Black Americans in this land to have finally been free for as long as they were enslaved. Do you understand that we still have a century to catch up as free people in this land for as long as we were slaves. That's how long it was. And I often try to share that with my students. Yes, it was some time ago, 150 years ago, but Harriet Tubman and Ronald Reagan walked this earth together too. Harriet Tubman and Ronald Reagan walked this earth together too. So how far apart are these histories really? Or what are their continuities? And that's what I think happens in between the earlier period of Callie House. Booker Washington becomes a key figure. He's not interested in reparations. He's interested in economic development through a program that is reproduced all over. Under Washington's lead, there were 60,000 African-American businesses. No one looking for handouts, welfare, integration, just economic opportunity and development. Andrew Carnegie and other wealthy individuals obviously provided that for Washington. Now, real quickly, so there's a sort of falling off in the 40s where it's mainly Black militants in the post-World War II period who begin to advocate for reparations. There was this one individual his name is slipping my mind right this second for a second. His work was called We Cried Genocide. I want to call it William Clay, but I don't think it was him. He says, We Cried Genocide. And this is where the first sort of effort, along with Du Bois, who helped, when the United Nations was founded here in San Francisco, to internationalize the Negro situation, to try to bring it before the international, arena of the UN, especially. This is something that Malcolm X took up later and thought he originated, but it had been tried much sooner. But for the most part, there was only the Black left radical militant element that began to advocate for reparations, I'd say, between World War II and about the 1990s. So from World War II, about the 1990s, the main proponents, the loudest people about reparations were usually the Black radicals, those who came in the nationalist or Black radical traditions. And it was ignored largely because of that. Groups like NCOBRA, N apostrophe Cobra, which is the National Committee for Reparations. There is also the Republic of New Africa, spelled with a K. That was an organization that Assata Shakur belonged to, Tupac Shakur, Afeni Shakur, the Mutulu Shakur. That's the group they belonged to, and they believed that there should be 5 states in the South that should be occupied by Blacks, like say Utah is occupied or dominated or led by or administered by Mormons, or Hawaii or Puerto Rico or Guam or American Samoa or the American Indian reservations. However, those different groups as subnational groups manage their predicament. The proposal for the Republic of New Africa was 5 southern states. So if you look them up online, they map out much of the Deep South, and they were advocating this as under Malcolm X in the 1960s. So again, from the 40s to the 60s and 70s up into the 80s, you only have like the Black radical Farrakhan left. Farrakhan is not a real proponent of reparations per se, but it's not something he would oppose. But I'm just giving you a sense of how it was unpopular in the Black liberal and Black or even the white liberal circles. But that changed when 2001, Randall Robinson, whose brother was Max Robinson, who died in their airplane crash, but was a DC insider, when he wrote The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. This is the first sort of signaling of the Black civil rights liberal establishment coming around to this question openly and publicly. And this book got a lot of traction. And it came right before a number of the disparities research was being generated after Occupy. So Occupy has a lot to do with the reparations movement. Occupy was the backdrop, the Arab Spring, this book here, I don't know if any of you read it, called The Spirit Level, was just one of many scholarly representations of showing how inequity and disparities were the real problem in society, and that if we could have more equal societies, we'd have less crime, we'd have less violence, we wouldn't have thugs, we wouldn't have ghettos. We wouldn't have young men walking down the street in front of us with their pants down to their ankles as they do nowadays, if there was more equality. And so this is what Wilkinson and Pickett, and I've used this book in my class previously, The Spirit Level, because it shows all of this research data. It's based on hard data, all of it, that shows measures of happiness, measures of engagement, and the more people have, the happier everyone is, and the less crime there is. It's no mistake that we've seen this crime spike, or at least this ostensible crime spike, happen right in the midst of the declaration of COVID, and we haven't really reset yet in some areas and in some ways. But that trauma certainly did something to all of us, and it's clearly having a particular impact on even less disciplined people, right, in terms of the criminal element. But as people are more equal, right, there's this belief that there would be less reason for truancy or inequality or homelessness or any environmental issues. And again, so this book is just one of many that was sort of bringing out the research of disparity. So Occupy is the backdrop. And underneath that, I'm suggesting to you, there were all kinds of manifestations around the world. Bernie Sanders' campaign is every bit important here, even if Bernie took a particular position on reparations that wasn't supportive, he was addressing those issues. Biden's Build Back Better and the Recovery Act, it's about a $5 or $6 trillion investment, more than the Great Society and New Deal. And Biden and Buttigieg are clear that a lot of this has to do with repairing old harms done by freeways, highways, housing construction, things of that sort, right? And that's what they're trying to reverse. But what I'm trying to convey is that for about 10 years, between the 1990s and the early 2000s, it was a swath of research that just showed all of these inequalities about, for example, how much the average African-American household held compared to the average white household, right? It was this disparities research. It showed that a Black man with a PhD had less of a chance in the job market than a white man with a felony, right? These were depressing data that came out. And New York Times and other outlets wrote about these things, and it was just dismal. In my own book on Black nationalism, the last paragraph, I cite a passage of a study done by a group that studies Martin Luther King's dream statistically. So they break down the dream around housing, jobs, marriage, education attainment, owning businesses. How are people realizing the dream? And this organization that does this study of King's dream every year suggested in 2011, and this is in my book on Black nationalism, it says that it would take average Blacks in America to catch up to average whites, not the affluent, not the top tier, just in home ownership alone, not wealth. It would take 1,666 years for Black America to catch up. Now, if that doesn't seem almost apocalyptic, in that it's a millennium of difference, and a half century, a millennium and a half, and a century. That's how far back this data they claim the situation to present. So that's really the backdrop to this drive for reparations, was the economic disparities exposed not just for Blacks, but for young white college students. That's what Bernie had been saying. The debt of our students, right, around the world, around the country, is the Generation X or Z. The idea of middle classdom, mortgages, cars, the middle class dream that we had, or coming up, these children can't even begin to conceive of, and that's part of the backdrop to these claims and these demands. And then what sort of seals the deal is Ta-Nehisi Coates's article, "The Case for Reparations," which was rated the top journalistic work of the decade when he wrote it in 2014. It, again, like Randall Robinson, Ta-Nehisi Coates is no, civil rights liberal, but he was no black nationalist radical either. And with his background and credentials at Howard, et cetera, and in journalism, when he writes his article, he does something different. He doesn't dwell on slavery to talk about reparations. And this is a breath of fresh air. Because for the previous 20 years in the Reagan Revolution, the pushback was, you weren't slaves, we didn't hold you slaves, affirmative action is reverse discrimination, welfare is undeserved, leave us alone. And what Coates did was he went into the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and updated the debate. He modernized the debate for reparations in terms of the injury around which claims blacks can make. And here's where San Francisco enters, not from slavery per se, but from the subsequent injury that was set up in the impacts of Jim Crow and other forms of segregation. And so, understanding, what Coates does in bringing it up to date, it resuscitates the debate in general, because it's no longer just on slavery. It's now on, well, okay, let's not talk about slavery anymore. Let's talk about what's happened since. And then that's where California falls under that umbrella more so than slavery. For slavery, California should give reparations to the Ohlone and to the Hopi Indians. If you read the book called Murder State, you'll see that genocide was the only word that could be used to describe what happened to the California Indians after their enslavement by the Spanish. And what's really scary, if you look at the dates of the killing of California Indians, it started 200 years after Columbus. 200 years after Cortez is when Leland Stanford and Serranus Hastings and John C. Fremont and George and William Randolph Hearst, these powerful names in California, conspired to eliminate 155,000 Native Americans in 20 years, and they were more brutal than even the previous generations of people that attacked Indians. So reparations in California for slavery is probably more of a claim of Indians, California Indians. And Indian gaming, in some people's view, is a form of it. And I'll get to that in a second. But for me, it's important for us to understand that California comes up under this other area of discrimination, of de jure or de facto, formal or informal discrimination around houses, around land confiscation, like at Bruce Beach, that was just sold back to the county in Los Angeles through eminent domain. There are thousands of cases like this around the country where people owned land and their lands were taken. This is what Coates does. So Coates modernizes the debate, and he re-energizes it because, again, the Reagan era had largely silenced people making claims about reparations, because Reagan's era said, you weren't slaves, we didn't make you slaves. So Coates says, okay, no more slavery talk. Let's talk about everything after slavery. And that's where, we are now. So in 2006 in San Francisco, we wrote, I was one of about 7 or 9 people who wrote something called the Slavery Disclosure Ordinance. And it was written in 2006, and it's reported every year. You can Google it online. This report is the most recent one was March 28th. Any corporation in San Francisco, as you see this paragraph here, the city administrator maintains it. So you can go to the city administrator's website and you can see all of the corporations in San Francisco who admit that they were tied to slavery. Bank of America admits in these papers 63 companies. And yet because it's voluntary in terms of reporting, and then they can voluntarily put money in an account that I don't know anything about the account. I never did know anything about the account, but I know there's an account that Bank of America, U.S. Bank, Aetna, any of the companies that were tied to slavery directly or indirectly have to disclose that. Here, Iowa, California, Los Angeles all have slavery disclosure ordinance. So California and Iowa, LA and San Francisco and a few other cities have slavery disclosure ordinances, just in case one day the reparations movement caught up with us. And that's what I'm saying is we've been focused on this work, and now people are coming around because of the George Floyd moment, right? All of this foundation I've tried to outline for you up to this point, it comes back to how did we get here in San Francisco? The foundation, is back east, national developments. In California, the demand for reparations is one, the Bruce Beach case. That was very important for this moment. But it's
Dr.
all
Taylor, Dr.
Mhm.
Taylor, could
Yep.
you speak about the current frame of San Francisco reparations
Yeah, I
effort?
got about 2 more slides, and I'll be there in a second because I'm trying to sort of this is part of the foundation of
I
it
want to
here.
leave a few minutes for Q&A after.
Right, I'm going to get through as soon as I can. Real
Okay.
quick, the real issue in San Francisco was not slavery; it was fugitivity. The big case was the Archie Lee case. That was the sort of death knell of the Black movement under Mary Ellen Pleasant here, when Archie Lee was finally sent back by the governor of California, who was then Supreme Court judge, sent him back to Mississippi to slavery. 850 Blacks left and went to Vancouver, British Columbia, and Archie Lee was one of them. And so that's part of the foundation of slavery. So what I'm suggesting to you is slavery here is not so much about slavery. It's more about something. It's twin. Its twin in California was fugitivity. That was the Black problem of California, not slavery, being a fugitive. And fugitivity was federal from 1789, and then again, it passed again in the 1850s. So fugitivity was all Black people's problem. Slavery was not the main issue in California. And then the period where Blacks are, again, this goes back to the period where California does come in. This research done by Albert Broussard, a native San Franciscan, the best book I've ever read on Black San Francisco, the history, the rich history, the Fillmore, the Western Addition, all the music, all the jazz, all the houses, all the opportunity, all the dreams, and all the disappointment. And the book by its side is similar. It focuses more on Black women laborers. It says the East Bay in the title, but the main focus is on Black women workers in San Francisco. This other clip is a 1993 publication that goes to the heart of the call for reparations in San Francisco. It documented all of the injury from 64 to 90, and it's a well-known report that has been on every mayor's desk since 1993, called the Unfinished Agenda. If you look up this 90-page report, you'll see here's where the case is made for reparations in San Francisco. California, I'm just noting here, this month, recently, California recognized in 2021 was the third state to approve a reparations program for forced fertilization, joining North Carolina and Virginia. So California is giving reparations right now. It's not been successful, but they're trying. To find 600 victims, they've only found 50 that they can give it to. They've rejected 100, so it's imperfect, but there is some other movement around here. This other article that you see here, California's Dark History, Forced Sterilization, just sort of documented online. California genocide, I talked about that. Japanese internment, I won't elaborate on that for the sake of time. Here is the California Reparations Task Force. You can look it up online in terms of what its goals and objectives are, its focus, and it's intended to develop a proposal to recommend appropriate ways to educate California public about the findings. And so it's really a California rendition of John Conyers' HR 40, which he proposed back in Washington, D.C. Finally, this turns to law enforcement, another injury. So I think there are 3 windows for for understanding reparations. One is injury of slavery itself. Then you have the decades of Jim Crow segregation, which was the law. And then you have the war on drugs that was declared. And tragically, most people don't know about this first incident that happens in Memphis. As soon as the Civil War ended, there was a police massacre on the Black community in Memphis. And this is the beginning of the Black and law enforcement relationship in America. So how do we come from that? Because if you read that book, you'll see what happens. And then here in the second picture, it happened at the bottom caption in 1917 in Houston, the very same thing where the Houston Police Department carried out a massacre on the Black community. So Black soldiers responded. You can find a movie right now on Netflix called The 24th. And it documents and dramatizes this whole history. So this has been recent. Look at the dates here in this book, Police in Urban America, 1860 to 1920. So you think about when slavery ends, and think about when Blacks migrate to the cities in the 19 teens. So Blacks and policing in America almost cutting their teeth in cities at the same time. And again, the nature of that relationship was obviously conflicted, but it begins in Memphis with a massacre. And then the final point is there was an outstanding book by Jerome Miller that was written in the 90s and republished again more recently that talks about the problem of policing in African-American men and young people in general, and how, again, the war on drugs should be included in the conversation on reparations. And I'll tell you this real quickly, 2 seconds. I was at an event at Merritt College with the now late former chief of police Lamont Armstrong, and a group full of experts brought together by Columbia University at Merritt to talk about all these issues. And all these experts kept talking about millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So I interrupted the room and said, why don't we give every child poor $250,000 up front, since you're going to invest it in them anyway on the criminal end? Why don't you give it to them up front so we can help them avoid those negative experiences? And the whole room got silent. This is about 4 years ago. The only person to speak up on my behalf was Lamont Armstrong. He said, Professor Taylor, in all of our experiences in West Oakland with OPD, it was always around our poverty. And that's what I don't think people appreciate. If you want to get rid of the fear of violence in the streets, this is not a threat. But it's just a suggestion, like King. You know, if we want our society to be better overall, then perhaps this is something that can benefit all. Here is an article or two that you can look into. These two articles look at white attitudes towards reparations, gives you some good data. Overwhelmingly, 2 out of 3 whites reject reparations in terms of money. They're much more tolerant of other forms like apology or some other kind of forms, but not the hard cash. Blacks are almost 90% opposite and are down for the hard cash. So there's a very big difference. But I want to say this finally. White opinion is now 30%. 15 years ago, it was less than 10%. In the 60s, it was almost 0%, unless you were just some of the radicals from SDS. So the idea that we're now at 30%, approaching 40% amongst whites alone, tells me that this movement is actually working, and I think that's what we should recognize. And the last comment I have here is that the last great American moment may very well be what could happen to this country in a positive way if we actually saw the realization of reparations. How would it transform communities? How would it transform lives? How would it transform families? How would it transform the relationship between Black Americans who are poor and the police, Black Americans and the white population more broadly? And I want to be clear, reparations is no longer about what white people did to Black people. Reparations is about what the American state did to Black people. And even if all the whites who were slaveholders and all the Blacks who were slaves were gone, every state that ever allowed slavery, from Washington, D.C. to New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and the southern states, are all still here, and they have the ability to remedy these. And here you see a listing in this paragraph of other people who have been made whole, or at least attempts were made to make them whole. And I'm suggesting that in making the Black group whole through reparations, America would have its it would have its next great moment or its last great moment, but it would be one of the greatest breakthroughs, kind of like what people felt emotionally when Obama was elected. People felt like this is a major, major thing. I'm saying it would go further than the symbolic importance of a Black president. It would come into transforming people's lives. I got 13 minutes to answer questions. I'll stop right there.
Can you stop sharing the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. That was an excellent present. Thank you so much for that dynamic and very compelling presentation.
Thank you.
Those who have questions, could you please raise your hands? And can we have this, no more, maybe eliminate the spotlight so we can see the entire range of participants instead? It'd be easier to pick out. Okay, so David or Alice, you have a question, and anybody else has a question, raise your hand.
Too. First, I'd like to know if we can get a copy of the PowerPoint, so that, because I'd like to get the bibliography of all the books and articles that you mentioned.
Sure.
Sure. Number 2 is, can you talk a little bit about the current status of what's going on in terms of reparations in the committee that's reviewing it in San Francisco? I've heard that they have put a dollar amount on it, but I don't know anything else about it.
Yeah, they made 111 recommendations, and one of them was a monetary stimulus. And the measure of the stimulus was basically looking at how in California and in New York, who was considered just above middle class. In LA, it was 2 million. In New York, it was 3 million. In San Francisco, it was 5 million. So as much as people thought 5 million was ridiculous, it's actually just above the, the median of middle income in San Francisco, based on some reports we saw. So the idea, the committee, we have a report to submit in June 2023. The committee sunsets on June 2024. It's only a recommendation to the board, and they have to make the decision as to what the next steps will be. The Human Rights Commission is sort of nursing this whole effort, so it's under its aegis. It was brought forth by Reverend Amos Brown. That's where the origins of this whole idea came from, apart from the national reckoning. Reverend Amos Brown approached the NAACP about it, and then Shaman Walton, as board member, got involved and sponsored this committee coming together, and that's how the committee's been organized. And each of the 15 members represent some specific issue or case. If you've been incarcerated, if your family lost property, if you were someone who's a senior citizen, if you were homeless, all of those kind of things, that you had to qualify for all 15 seats.
Okay, Michael Lyon, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Thank you. So Professor Taylor, you've been talking a lot about history, and I was wondering if you knew of a good reference that would talk about the longshore or dock workers strikes in New Orleans around the turn of the century, which were incredibly integrated. It says that under both black and white workers insisted that any work crew hired by ship owners be 50% black and 50% white, so they would work side by side and perform the same work, and use that as a way of preventing racism from dividing the New Orleans dock workers.
Right.
Do you know any background about this?
I don't. I'm not familiar with it. One of my colleagues, I think, who is from New Orleans, is working on a book on it, Cedric Johnson, and because he started looking at the Black left and trying to outline sort of the lost, like the same way I tried to outline Cali House, looking at some of the lost history there around Black left unions. A more popular story would be, of course, Asa Philip Randolph and C.L. Dellums with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters here in Oakland, but that's a powerful story in New Orleans as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a nirvana.
The Coach article, you can just Google it online, just by the title. It's all over the place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for, is there anybody else has a question right now? Okay. Question I have is, some say that reparations should be approached nationally, not state by state.
Right.
Could you make the case for San Francisco's reparations effort and compare it to the state commission? And
That's a great point. And that's what
the federal bill.
Yeah, that's great. And that's what I think, is sort of a logistical issue, trying to find any vulnerability in the system, which is what movements do. They look for vulnerabilities and then try to seize upon it. Darity, who wrote the book From Here to Equality, the foremost scholar on reparations right now at Duke University, he rejects these piecemeal efforts like Evanston, Illinois, San Francisco, Berkeley, or Asheville, North Carolina. And he would only have Darity a top-down federal plan and program, because that's the only source that really has the capacity to do the kind of things that need to be done, apart from cash stimulus in terms of infrastructure, developing neighborhoods, roads, jobs, things of that sort. Again, I think, Biden can't call his plan reparations, but Biden's plan, it does a lot for what people want reparations to do, but it can't be framed as such. But I'm telling you, I know the plan. And I don't understand the violence right now and the unemployment rate and the plan. I'm thinking, when you see the plan, it should cause young people to put down guns and go get training, because you don't even need a college education to make $90,000 in this economy that Biden's creating. So it's really trying to make up for some of the injuries that have been carried out by previous governments around housing and jobs. Yes. The New Deal, the Great Society, the New Deal didn't trickle down into the African-American community sufficiently. So Biden is trying to fix that with to build back better. But most people don't appreciate that. And of course, he can't call it reparations, but I'm saying it's effectively trying to do something like that. But so there are all these layers and overlaps. And I would say Gavin Newsom is important because, even though Bill Clinton and Biden, are these, figures that blacks have supported, neither of them supports reparations. Gavin Newsom has actually made moves to make this possible. And if Gavin became president, that would be very interesting because then you have the first leading figure who's I don't know if he's for it, but he sure is acting like he is. And I don't know if he'd be able to be for it outside of California, but within the state, he's not telling us it's a non-starter. And Dr. Weber is trusting him. And Gavin appoints 4 of the committee members of the 9 state members, and Amos Brown is on both the city committee and the state committee. So that's the connection. We asked him to help us sort of stay calibrated, but we're really doing 2 different jobs. And it's also true that a lot of what the state is saying in this document is based on what has happened in San Francisco. Because up until 1903, San Francisco was the main black place in California, not LA. 1906. After the 1906 earthquake, LA becomes more important. But up until 1906, the main black place in the West Coast is San Francisco, California. So Gavin, what I'm trying to get at is Gavin Newsom, I think, did something very powerful for marriage equality and marijuana legalization. Now think about both of those. Marijuana legalization, it didn't come from above. It came from 14th and Broadway, Amsterdam. And all of the advocacy around that nonstop, decades of advocacy. The next thing you know, we got a Jesuit Pope, a black president, and marijuana legalization. That's all radical stuff. And then we got from the same man who's behind marriage equality. Again, did any of us in our lifetime think we'd ever see marriage equality the way we see it now from above? But it didn't come from above. It came from the steps of San Francisco City Hall and the grassroots movement there. So that's why I believe if it can happen anywhere at the state level, we're in the right place because this is the place that promoted other unpopular ideas like marriage equality and marijuana legalization that are now more widely accepted around the country. And that's why I'm hopeful about reparations. Is that this is not about the end result of reparations being granted. I don't think people understand this is a movement by itself that's going to have its own outcomes that we are not able to determine yet. We don't know what's going to come out of this. We got Juneteenth. Who saw that coming? Who saw Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday? That's another major step. For the first time, the federal government is acknowledging, apart from the 13th Amendment, that the slavery injury happened. And Juneteenth, again, to me, if blacks can't organize and their allies can't organize behind Juneteenth to make a case of reparations, then that's a shame on them because Biden put it there for everybody to see. And now it's a question of, can you continue to organize around that to get your political ends? So that's politics. That to me becomes get your knuckles dirty, find your allies, and then go fight for this issue and make it more popular, like marijuana legalization and marriage equality.
Okay, thank you. And our last questions from Dr. Terry Palmer. Go ahead, Terry.
Oh, hi. My understanding is that on February 7th, the Board of Supervisors had a hearing and then they kind of delayed making a decision. And do you have any suggestions for people that are sort of local about how we can play into that?
March 14th is the hearing in person where we finally get in front of the board. There will be more of the the committee's meetings itself, and it has these public comment and if the public comments are actually a part of the record. So whatever San Franciscans have said have been documented. We tried to incorporate public comments into these outcomes. And here's the other thing. The committee is not allowed to organize people to turn out to support this.
But the Great Panthers could.
Right. But the way they told us the Human Rights Commission said we can't be the the committee then organizing people against the city council at the same time. So we have to encourage our allies and friends. They have to do the I'm talking about just the 15 board members. We can't have all these town halls. We're trying, but we're not supposed to be. We're trying to have these town halls at USF, at San Francisco State, at City College, trying to bring it out into the community. We're looking for bus announcements and billboard announcements. We're working on all of that right now, but nothing has given us the publicity that $5 million amount gave.
Right.
That was a stroke of genius. The data showed, the HRC reported to us, it showed, and we got 1 second left. It showed that before the January 15th, which is the day of Chronicle reported, we had like 300 total hits. The day that article hit, we had 11,000 hits in one day. So we got the recognition and publicity, and nothing's final. Both of these committees, the state and city, are both still working on, I don't know, we might merge into one. We might decide to defer to the state. We haven't worked that out yet, but the people of San Francisco, the people who are London Breed's age, that's the generation that really wants this, because they feel like they were the ones whose parents had, and then they lost it in terms of them being able to pass it on. So that's the real generational sort of sensibility. And I don't want to go into any more of Tessa's time. Thank you all so much for your time. If you can email me at taylorj@usfca.edu, taylorj@usfca.edu, and I'll be glad to go back and forth and email you and give you the source material. Yep, there it is. Give you the source material you want. And again, thank you all for having me back. Chester, good luck. I'm going to go and get ready for my class. And I wish you all the best. Keep up the fight. Don't stop the fight. Let's keep up fighting. It's too much to lose not to keep fighting. Let's go down swinging. That's what I say. Let's go down swinging.
Thanks
Take
for being
care,
here.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Let's have a round of applause for Dr. James Taylor. And now our next speaker is going to be Chesa Boudin, who's a Yale Law School graduate in San Francisco's elected, but now former groundbreaking progressive district attorney. He was recalled from office last year by those in and outside San Francisco who support misguided policies that are allegedly tough on crime. And that was even before he began his term of office, after which he took action to implement bold new humane policies for justice for all, from bail reform to addressing police accountability measures, such as filing charges against an SFPD officer in the first ever use of force case against an off-duty officer for excessive force. This is the first time Chesa Boudin has spoken to a meeting of the SF Panthers. Welcome, Chesa Boudin.
Well, thank you, Art, and thank you all for the work you do. And obviously, many of you are folks who I've worked with and gotten to know over the years, and it's great to see you. Others I haven't had a chance to meet in person, and I look forward to doing so when time and circumstances allow. I really want to save as much time as possible for questions. I want to try to address whatever the particular concerns that you all may have are. But let me just start with a few minutes of context. And I want to kind of divide my opening remarks into what I'll call three categories. The first one is kind of what happened prior to my administration, what we did and tried to do during my tenure, the roadblocks we encountered. And then finally, I'll just touch very briefly on what's happened in the 8 months or so since I was removed from office. And then I'll save, as I said, the rest of the time for questions. So the history of San Francisco when it comes to policing and police use of force is in many ways tragically similar to so much of the rest of the country. Police have historically in San Francisco played a role that all too often is synonymous with protecting the interests of the white and the privileged against the poor, people of color, immigrant, and underprivileged. That's a long, deep-rooted history in which the police have been at the front lines of exacerbating and amplifying racial disparities. We know that, for example, just to give you one example, it's been well documented both by the ACLU, by the Obama Department of Justice, and many other reputable institutions and organizations that the San Francisco Police Department is the department in the state of California with by far the worst disparities when it comes to racial prejudice in traffic stops. And we know that traffic stops sound silly and minor, but putting aside the humiliation, the delay, the inconvenience, that they cause to people, the role that those sorts of things can play in intergenerational degradation. We know that also traffic stops are one of the main ways in which people end up getting killed when there's interactions with police. We've seen that time and time and time again, not just in San Francisco, but across the country. And we also know that far more often and perhaps more mundane than situations that start as a traffic stop and end up with an officer involved shooting and killing are that what starts off as what we call a pretextual traffic stop, a stop because of license tags that have expired or because of a turn signal light that's not fully functional. The reality is those pretextual stops are just that, pretext for searching, interrogating people, almost always people of color, and that people in San Francisco who are Black and brown are far more likely as a percentage of the population to be stopped, and if stopped, searched, and if searched, arrested, and if arrested, jailed, and if jailed, charged with crimes than in any other major city in the state of California. So that's a small piece of the history, and as I mentioned, that history in far too many instances has led to people getting killed or seriously injured. In the period, maybe 5 years or so before I was elected in 2019, we saw a string of police-involved killings, some related to traffic stops like Jessica Williams, others, many others involving other circumstances. Alex Nieto was minding his own business in Bernal Heights Park. Mario Woods was having a mental health crisis in Bayview. Luis Gongora was in a homeless encampment. We could keep going, right? There's so many of these folks whose names we know who have been killed at the hands of SFPD. And the norm in the many years prior to my administration was that there would be a moment of community outrage at worst or at best. And then the police would hold a hearing. They would show body-worn camera footage when that existed, which had only started to exist several years ago. And then there would be a lengthy investigation by the Department of Police Accountability that would result in recommendations to the police chief and the police commission. Those recommendations were generally not public. Any discipline imposed on the officer or officers was generally not public. And the DA's office would usually conduct its own criminal investigation, which would generally take years and would invariably result in no charges being filed. I say invariably because it just didn't happen. Because no matter what the conduct, police officers could commit crimes with impunity in the city, as in so much of the country. Now, when I campaigned for office in 2019, one of the issues that was important to voters, that was important to me and to the folks who got me elected, many of you on this call I know were dedicated volunteers. One of the issues that was important was police accountability, was a commitment to have a system of law where we have actually equal enforcement, as our Constitution promises, where we have not just one system for most of us and a separate system for the wealthy, the powerful, the well-connected, and those who wear uniforms. What we were fighting for was a system where if police committed crimes, just like anybody else, they would face consequences. Where we were fighting to restore the trust that ideally all of us should be able to have. And as importantly, that people in the Tenderloin and the Bayview and the Western Addition should be able to have in uniform law enforcement. Trust that we know is largely non-existent. And so we were fighting for that, recognizing that it was going to be an uphill battle. And I want to just transition now for a moment to what we did while I was in office. We fought on many different fronts to begin enforcing laws equally, including when police were the ones being investigated. And it took a number of forms, and we faced a number of challenges, some anticipated, others totally unexpected. One of the things we did that was groundbreaking was we took to trial the first ever officer use of force case, the first ever case in which a police officer in San Francisco on duty was accused of using force that amounted to criminal use of force. It was a case, thankfully, not a killing, not a case involving a gun. It was a case involving a man named Dakari Spires, who was out in Fisherman's Wharf with his girlfriend, and someone called the police on them. They're both African American. And the police who arrived without asking questions or investigating immediately laid hands on him, threw him on the ground, brutally assaulted him with a baton, breaking multiple bones. Now, that happened before my administration, but it was during my tenure that we filed those charges and ultimately took that case to trial. It was the first time ever in San Francisco history, as far as we're aware, as far as we've been able to find, when any on-duty police officer went to face a jury of our peers for allegations of excessive force. Now, I don't think there's anybody in this room, I don't think there's anybody in this city who would seriously argue that no police officer in San Francisco history has ever used excessive force while on duty. Right? I mean, that's, of course, it's happened somewhere, sometime. So why hasn't there ever been a trial? Why hasn't there ever been a reckoning where our community gets to pass judgment on whether or not what occurred was criminal until my administration? Well, it speaks to the challenges, to the hand in glove relationship between the district attorney's office and the police department that has led for so many generations district attorneys to simply refuse to enforce criminal laws when police are the ones violating them. Whether we're talking about shootings, beatings, or other kinds of crime, stealing time from the city, embezzlement, falsifying police reports, perjury, you name it. District attorneys depend on police for more than 99% of the cases we file. Police are the main witnesses in more than 99% of cases that district attorneys prosecute, and therefore, district attorneys are very hesitant to do anything that could jeopardize their close working relationship with the police. And that comes at a real cost. It comes at a cost to the honesty and the integrity of our judicial system. It comes at a cost to the trust that people in over-policed communities have in police, and it comes at a cost to equal protection under law. So we also filed other cases. That was just one of them. We also filed the first ever homicide charges in San Francisco history against a police officer who shot and killed an unarmed Black man while on duty. We filed the second such case and many more. Along the way, we encountered, as I said, many obstacles. One of those obstacles, and hopefully we'll have a chance in the Q&A to dig into some of the nitty gritty here, but the actual practical and procedural and bureaucratic mechanisms through which cases are investigated, cases are filed, cases are prosecuted, are really important to understand the kinds of obstacles we face. There are many people, and there was a time when I was one of these people, believed that all it took to have police accountability was electing a prosecutor with the independence and the political will to enforce the law equally. That all it took was having the person in that office who was elected, who had the courage to do the right thing when there was a case of police wrongful use of force. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. A lot more complicated for a number of reasons. One of them being that the district attorney himself or herself is not the one that initiates criminal charges. Yes, they have a staff, they have a team, but the formal mechanism through which a criminal case is commenced under California law is either a arrest leads to a 48-hour window when charges can be filed, or a peace officer writes an arrest warrant, takes that arrest warrant to a judge agrees that there's probable cause, and then signs the warrant, which can then initiate the criminal case. Or third, you go to a grand jury and you secure a grand jury indictment. None of those are things the DA himself or herself can personally do. And we know that in cases where police officers use force, their fellow officers are not going to arrest them on the scene the way that would happen to any one of us. And so we're really left with two options. One, get an arrest warrant signed, or two, go to a grand jury. Well, it turns out to get a grand jury convened, that's not just up to the district attorney. The presiding judge of the Superior Court has to be willing to do that and has to approve what cases and investigations are going to be presented, has to manage that entire process. Tell you, during COVID, it was very difficult to convene grand juries. It was very difficult to do the kinds of investigations or indictments that we sought to do. The other mechanism, as I said, is you get a arrest warrant signed and you take it to a judge. But the arrest warrant affidavit has to be written by a peace officer, In other words, by a district attorney investigator or a police officer or a sheriff's deputy. In other words, in order to initiate a criminal case against,
I'll call these people peace officers.
I'm sorry?
Please don't interrupt the speaker.
Oh, well, yeah, no, it's not that, that's a legal term of art. It's not that I'm suggesting that they play that role or what have you, but literally what the statutory language said was it has to be a peace officer, it has to be somebody who is what they call post-certified, police officer standardized training certified. To be a district attorney investigator, you have to go through post-training. That means that you have to, in most instances, be a retired cop or sheriff's deputy. So what that means as a practical matter is that in order for us to, when I was the DA, in order for my team to initiate a criminal case against a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, that we had to have one of the retired police officers who worked in our office write an affidavit, sign the affidavit, and take it to a judge and ask them to sign it. Well, you can see what the problem is. We know there's a culture of impunity. We know that police officers don't like to point the finger at their own, that they protect their own, that they close ranks, that there's the thin blue line. And so we had, and this isn't unique to my administration, I knew this was a problem because I heard from many other lawyers who had worked in the San Francisco team responsible for investigating and prosecuting police, that the investigators in that unit simply refused to do their job. They refused to investigate, they refused to write arrest warrants, they refused to gather information, they had no interest. Remember, these are all people who retired from other police departments, Berkeley, LA, Oakland, different CHP, what have you. All of these folks who were responsible for investigating police excessive force in San Francisco were themselves retired police officers. And what I heard from lawyer after lawyer who had been in that team, who had quit because they were frustrated with the inability to do the job they'd signed up for, was that the investigators were unwilling to do the work. Well, we faced lots of similar challenges. We faced challenges on many fronts. And I'm proud to tell you that one of my accomplishments was working with then State Senator, now US Congresswoman, Sidney Kamlager, to change the statute in California in order to allow people other than quote unquote peace officers, allow people other than post-certified law enforcement to write those arrest warrant affidavits. And that was an important change. It means that now, for example, if we wanted to initiate a case against a police officer, we could have a lawyer or a non-sworn investigator write that arrest warrant affidavit, assuming they were familiar with the facts. So those are some of the really technical kinds of changes that we had to fight to make. I also had to recruit investigators who weren't from police backgrounds, and I had to send them to police officer standardized training school, which was a 6-month process. We had to send them there so that we had people who weren't part of the culture of the thin blue line, people who joined the team, had the qualifications, the certifications to do the work, but who were actually there to do the work, not simply to obstruct and block and prevent any police officer from ever being charged with a crime. Obviously, we faced lots of hurdles. We lost that first trial that I mentioned in which Takari Spire's arms were broken and legs were broken. We lost that trial in large part because of the tremendous resources that not only the Police Officers Association dedicated and the law firm they hired dedicated to the case, but because of the complicity of the police department in really unprecedented ways of collaborating with a defendant in a criminal case in the middle of trial to undermine the prosecution, to make a spectacle in the media out of the case, to smear and jeopardize myself, my office, and our prosecution of this officer. So, you know, we faced many obstacles. And of course, one of the reasons why I was recalled was because we were doing this work. And the police department made every effort, and the Police Officers Association made every effort to undermine me, my administration, and our efforts to hold police who used excessive force accountable. After we lost the recall, the mayor appointed Brooke Jenkins to the Office of District Attorney, and she has since dismantled the unit I built for police accountability. She fired more than half the lawyers. She hasn't replaced them. Many of the investigators left. The ones who were actually doing the job, who had a real interest in doing the work well, all left or were reassigned to other units. And she has now begun the process of dismissing the cases that we filed. She's announced last week that she's going to dismiss the case against former Officer Samayoa, who shot and killed Keita O'Neill back in 2017 while he was running unarmed. Officer Samayoa shot him through the window of a moving police car, shattering the window, one bullet hitting Mr. O'Neill in the back of the neck, killing him. Mr. O'Neill was running away. He was unarmed. He was not attacking anybody. He was not, there were no civilians nearby. There was no justification. In fact, the police department fired Officer Samayoa almost immediately for that shooting in violation of protocol. The city settled the civil lawsuit for millions of dollars with his family. And the judge who reviewed the arrest warrant affidavit signed it, believing there was probable cause. And yet the current DA was unwilling to even put evidence in front of the public in a preliminary hearing. Unwilling, announced that she's going to be dismissing that case. And I have every reason to expect that she'll be dismissing the case we filed against Officer Shah, who shot and killed Sean Moore, who was unarmed in his own home, on his own steps, not being investigated for a felony, having not committed a crime that was even worthy of arrest, having had 5 separate judges and separate proceedings rule that Officer Shah was trespassing on Mr. Moore's property at the time. He first pepper sprayed him and then batoned him and then shot him, ultimately resulting in his death. I filed that criminal case. DA Jenkins has every intention of dismissing it. And you don't need to take my word for it. The mother of Mr. Sean Moore, Cleo Moore, wrote an op-ed in the Chronicle, was it last week, a week and a half ago, describing the way that this DA's office has been treating her, ignoring her. She doesn't even know which lawyer, if any, is assigned that case. There's been no effort to move the case forward, to have hearings, to keep victims and their families informed, as is required by California's Constitution, Marcy's Law. So we are in really reactionary times. We are moving back towards a time when police have every reason to believe that they can lie, cheat, steal, and even kill with impunity in this city. It's depressing. It is a long-term strategy, and it is a long-term strategy on their part, and our effort has to be equally long-term. Our work has to be equally relentless and creative. We cannot simply give up the fight. We cannot simply say that we tried and lost. I think if we look at the kind of work that it took the far right wing in this country to overturn Roe v. Wade, that was a 50-year campaign. And they didn't give up, and they kept fighting. And they used every trick in the book, many of them dirty and dishonest, to pack the Supreme Court to get what they wanted. We have justice on our side. We have integrity on our side. And so it is my sort of closing message to you as I open up for questions, that as frustrating as these setbacks are to all of us as a city, and of course to me personally, I believe that, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. And we've got to remember the long view. We've got to continue to do the day-to-day work to make possible the kind of change in our community that makes us proud to call San Francisco home, that makes this the kind of city that I want to raise my 17-month-old son in. And I think we are doing that work. We continue to do that work. So many of you are involved in that work. And we know that there are setbacks, and we know that there are disappointments, and we've got to power through them and continue to fight for justice, because that's the direction that history is bending in. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chesa. Okay, we're going to take questions now. We stop spotlighting Chesa for a moment, and so we can see everybody who's in the Zoom, so we can look for those hands. Thank you very much. And there's, I don't see a hand yet, but there's one question in the chat that I'm going to read and expand on. Sue Englander, now that you're no longer in office, how can we apply pressure to try children as children and restore the unit on investigating police crimes, and where? And I'll have a follow-up.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, with me not in office, these are decisions that are really up to the district attorney who was appointed by London Breed. DA Jenkins has made very clear, A, that she intends to prosecute juveniles as adults, and B, that she has no interest in investigating or prosecuting police. It's obviously disappointing to see those kinds of changes in San Francisco. What can we do? I think these are things that so many of you on this group, and I know you, Sue, have a long history of doing, which is organizing, community work, raising awareness, getting people to pay attention. This is work that can be done through organizations like the Great Panthers, like the Harvey Milk Democratic Club, like the Latinx Democratic Club. So many of the grassroots political groups and labor unions that care about these issues, that were out there marching after George Floyd was murdered in 2020, but seem to have moved on. I think we need to remind those people that these are issues we care about, that these are issues that are defining for our generation and for our city. And we've got to continue to put political pressure. If there was a large mobilization of the kind that existed after Mario Woods and Alex Nieto were killed, the kind of mobilization that resulted in Chief Greg Suhr being forced to resign from the San Francisco Police Department. If we had that kind of political pressure on the DA's office, I think we'd see a change in their policies.
Yeah, the follow-up is, I think I heard you speak on Hard Knock Radio, and I believe you alluded to the fact that this is going to have to come from the grassroots. The pressure is going to have to come from us if we want to change these policies. Too often we see politicians pandering to fear and stoking it for, when they, I saw there was a article in the 48 Hills with Tim Redmond talking about, Jerry Brown being on KPFA one day and then hearing his constituents talk about fear of crime and pandering to that fear in office and urging a tough on crime approach, which brought in mentoring of young policemen by veterans who were very harsh. So I think it probably is up to us and to organize. And did you have a comment or response to that? I think you spoke about that just before.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add briefly. I think, whenever the public raises criticisms or concerns about police practices, whether it's Tyree Nichols in Memphis, whether it's any of the cases we've discussed earlier today, George Floyd, usually what the police union response is, looks something like this: oh, well, we need more resources for training so that we can make sure people understand better practices. We need more resources to hire additional officers so that we can take more control of these situations and de-escalate. It's overwhelming force that can de-escalate a situation. So often the answer when we see excesses by police departments or violations is that they need more resources. And I believe that to function well, institutions do need to be adequately staffed and adequately resourced. I do believe training is important. I don't believe those are primary solutions to these problems. And I'll just tell you why. We see that throughout this country's history and throughout, the last few years, we see that violence is such a inherent part of what police are doing in communities of color, that I don't think it's enough to say we're going to have different training or more training. I think we need to think more systemically about how we reform and reduce the footprint of the police department. You look at a place like Eugene, Oregon, and they're not training their police how to de-escalate interactions with people who are mentally ill or how to administer life-saving overdose reversal drugs. What they're doing is developing alternatives to the police to handle those kinds of calls. Eugene, Oregon, as just one example, has a three-tiered response to 911 calls, right? In San Francisco, you get the police, or you get the fire department. In Eugene, Oregon, you get the police, you get the fire department, or you get a team of social workers and medical professionals called cahoots that have a 24/7 response capacity and that show up without guns or handcuffs or citation books, and that show up to try to get people in crisis help. And they're expert at navigating homeless shelters and other resources for people in crisis, mental health services, drug treatment facilities. And cahoots handles fully a third of all of the 911 calls in Eugene, Oregon. What that does is it means we don't need to throw more money at a problem or at a bureaucracy that's not really set up to deal with the problems it's confronted. Police are not set up, they're not trained, and no amount of training is going to make them the appropriate agency to deal with homelessness or mental health crises or drug addiction. And so instead of throwing more money and thinking that somehow we're going to incarcerate our way out of poverty or addiction, I think we need to start investing in alternatives and limit the role of the police to the things that they're uniquely positioned to do. Now, there's some people on this call who may think that there's no role for police, and we can have that conversation. But I think we can all agree that to the extent there is a role for police to play, they're uniquely positioned to respond to violent crimes in progress, right? They're not well positioned to respond to the kinds of calls that dominate the quality of life concerns so many voters in San Francisco have expressed over the last few years. Let me stop there and make space for other questions.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and I did want to first expand on your Eugene, was it the town in Oregon you just mentioned that you cited as a positive example? Are there other such examples of?
There are, and there's a number of other cities. I mean, that's the most well-developed one. There's different iterations, and they've tried similar things in parts of Hawaii. They've tried similar things. Even in San Francisco, we had a couple different models. They just were never invested in any serious way. They never had the scale that were needed to address the demand. But if you give me a second, I'm going to pull up a link. We did I had a podcast when I was in office. We did 2 seasons. It was called Chasing Justice. And we did a long interview with the guy who runs the Cahoots program. I'm going to put that link in to the chat here for people. If you're interested, you can listen to it through that link. This is a while ago now, but he provides a ton of data and other examples of programs like his around the country that are doing similar work.
Okay, the question from the chat was regarding the Atlanta Police Foundation and Cop City. And Cop City's been in the news, combining environmentalism and police reform, I think. Is there a SF Police Foundation that's also subsidizing militarization of police? And what should we be paying attention to regarding use of high-tech policing, like armed robots, which has come up in front of the SF Board of Supervisors?
Yeah, there are lots of organizations, some sort of public and transparent-ish, and others that are shadow and much harder to understand their role, that are playing a role in advocating for militarization of police, for impunity for police, for increasing police budget, and so on. You know, and some of these groups, like the Police Officers Association, are well known to all of us in San Francisco for the really racist and reprehensible role that association has played in local politics, you know, for decades. Other groups are set up as nonprofits. There's a group called Safer SF that's a 501c3 that moves a lot of money in various capacities aimed at helping to make the city safer, but often it's a kind of a cheerleader for the police and for policing as solutions to our problems. You've got other groups like the Chamber of Commerce or like the Union Square Association of Merchants that are, you know, organizations that are set up to lobby for and represent the interests of, you know, very particular economic interests. And often those groups are moving lots of money into policing, either directly through the kind of private surveillance camera networks that we see in Union Square in Japantown, for example, and Tenderloin, or through intense lobbying and advocacy at City Hall for more money to go into policing. That's how, for example, we got a law passed, Supervisor Safai sponsored it, that made sheriffs as well as police eligible to get paid as what they call 10B or 10C in the case of sheriffs, for uniformed overtime work that they get paid by the private businesses to stand in front of Union Square luxury goods outlets, for example, get paid on top of their salary and wear their uniforms. You know, that kind of thing. Moonlighting is what it's often referred to. When it comes to militarization, yeah, I mean, there's federal money that moves towards local police departments, and I think one really effective way to shift the direction of local policing is through federal grants. Sadly, we have not seen a lot of you know, proactivity or initiative from the Biden administration on that front. You know, I think we've seen them put a lot of money into local policing, but not use that money as a lever to require reforms or meaningful metrics of success. Certainly, the police department in San Francisco has demonstrated repeatedly that it's willing to violate the law using facial recognition technology in violation of local ordinance, cooperating with federal authorities in violation of local regulations, adopting the use of killer robots, as I think you mentioned, without making it public or going through the required process. So we do, in many ways, have a rogue agency here in the form of our local police department. They are not interested in abiding by the rules, and just like individual officers, they have good reason to believe that they can get away with not following the rules. And I think that's something that, if we believe in the rule of law, if we believe in democracy and in a system of government where the people control the individual agencies and elected officials, not the other way around, then I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that that our agencies that are empowered to carry guns and handcuffs and make arrests comply very strictly with the letter of the law. That's not happening in San Francisco today.
Chessa,
Art, can you hear me?
yes. Yeah.
Since you mentioned Cahoots, great speaker, I wanted to have a quick comment. I'm Lou in Portland, Oregon, and Cahoots is in Eugene. I had a comment and then a question for you and the former DA. Cahoots was a model in Portland, Oregon for Portland Street Response, which now also exists along the similar lines. But based on what your former DA has been talking about, there's also a tug of war between three progressive advocates for police reform. Brian Decker, who ran for DA in Washington County, who lost last year to a traditional district attorney. Mike Schmidt, who's Multnomah County District Attorney, now a progressive. There's no recall against him, but there's already TV ads by a business group against him next year in the election. Mike Schmidt just talked to our Portland Gray Panthers chapter last week, and he's talked to us a couple times about interrupting the school to prison pipeline and other reforms. Ellen Rosenblum, who's the Oregon Attorney General, talked with Mike Schmidt the last time at our forum. But there's also pushback, of course. So the woman who pushed police accountability on the Portland ballot, which passed on Portland City Council, Joanne Hardesty, she faced re-election this year and was defeated. She's the first Black woman in the history of Portland City Council to serve on City Council. So those are kind of my comments about some things happening up here. Cahoots is a great program and it's been a model. My question, and I can ask Art about this later, because we've been trying to do a lot of West Coast cross-state organizing in Gray Panthers, is if it's feasible to try to bring your former DA and perhaps the mom who wrote the op-ed to speak at Portland State. We've brought Medea Benjamin from San Francisco, and my school, Portland State, paid $2,000 to bring her up to talk. She's with Global Exchange and Code Pink. So that's my comment and question. Sorry if I interrupted, Art.
It's okay. Chessa, you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, I know Mike Schmidt well. I know about some of the challenges. I was just texting with him yesterday, as a matter of fact. So, you know, I have some appreciation for many of the issues you raised, and definitely, you know, Mike and I have done events together in the past, and I think we're both big believers in solidarity within this movement. I know that we all have different circumstances and different challenges and opportunities, and people are different, but big picture, I believe that the criminal justice reform work that I've dedicated my life to cannot be achieved if we all only work in one lane. I think we need to break down dogma. We need to divide. We need to break down the divides. I think there's a role for progressive prosecutors. There's a role for abolitionists. There's a role for everybody in between. And so, yes, to your question, Lou, you know, if you want to get my email address from Art or reach out to me, we can certainly talk about me coming up to Portland. I'd be happy to do it, sure. You know, if we can arrange it.
That's great.
Okay, Michael Lyon, go ahead. You're muted.
Hi. So, you know, part of the problem is that, you know, after each police atrocity, there's huge and very militant protests, but they eventually die down. But there are some protests that have been going on for years. One of them has to do with the Flores family in Los Angeles, and there's another one that's been going on in Baltimore. I think part of the reason that these have been so long lasting is because there's leadership in there that realizes the ultimate role of the police is to suppress class struggle, and that revolution is really the only way to permanently solve this problem. And so it's a way that by having this long range, this combination of a long range outlook and a very militant short range outlook, it's been able to keep this movement going and recruit new people on the basis of having to fight police power per se, rather than particular atrocities. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, just at a high level, I will say I agree that we need long range and short range. I mean, you're right. So many of these things, even George Floyd, right, which I think is safe to say, and some of you being great Panthers have a little more experience and perspective historically that I can speak to from my lived experience. But I think it's safe to say that the movement that rose up in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020 was the biggest civil rights movement in American history. It wasn't the longest lasting, but it was the biggest in terms of the number of people that got involved. We had major Fortune 500 corporations like Walmart and Amazon and all these different groups tweeting out that Black Lives Matter. Now, it was symbolic, it was performative. They weren't interested in system change, but the fact that the movement had that kind of reach, had that many people getting involved. I mean, if all the people who've been marching in San Francisco to oppose, police brutality and in support of Black Lives Matter in 2020 had showed up to vote against my recall, then I'd still be in office today, right? So somehow we need to figure out a way to both harness that short-term energy that happens, as you said, Michael, after each new incident, where people get outraged and sort of, are looking for, are looking for a way to channel their righteous rage, and we need to harness that into longer-term systemic change.
We have a question in the chat from someone who wants to ask, do you have any thoughts on the election of new Oakland DA Pamela Price and new Mayor Sheng Tao's firing of OPD Chief Armstrong?
Well, I'll just say that I know both of them. I think highly of both of them, and I'm optimistic about what they'll be able to achieve. I want to also be very clear. They're going to face tremendous headwinds, and many, including the local police departments in Alameda County and in Oakland in particular, are going to do whatever they can to undermine their administrations. And so I think we all need to be ready for the spin machine. It's already kicking into high gear. The way that they amplify crime and crime trends, they refuse to do their basic job when they don't agree with the mayor or the DA. These are two women of color who have been very transparent and clear throughout their careers about what their values are. And I just think we all need to be prepared for them to come under the kind of relentless attack that I came under from the media, from local electeds, from the billionaire class. It takes more than electing the right person. It takes a movement behind that person. And so, I'm anxious about the kinds of obstacles they're going to face, having faced many of them myself. But I'm excited for the possibilities. And I think in many ways, Alameda County and Oakland in particular has a stronger, grassroots movement when it comes to criminal justice than San Francisco does. Because it's a much more diverse place with more people who are directly impacted. And as they say, the people who are closest to the problems are the ones who tend to have the solutions. And in San Francisco, we're down to about 3% of our voters who are Black.
Maybe we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions. It occurs to me you're talking about Oakland, and in the Tim Redmond 48 Hills article, he cites Oakland as being an outlier in being able to push back against law enforcement excesses. And another example of that is, you may be familiar with Oakland Privacy Working Group, known as Oakland Privacy. They fought back against conventions coming to Oakland that were promoting militarization of the police. And they also fought against a surveillance center. They have been at it for years, a lot of hard work organizing that has borne fruit. So there's a good model there too. Are there any more questions for Chesapeake?
I really do appreciate the conversation. Oh, you have one more? Go ahead.
One more. Quick one, Diana. Unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether, given the spate of recalls and planned recalls, you have any suggestions about fending off future ones of progressives in San Francisco, on the Board of Supervisors particularly?
Yeah, well, I see, Diana, your question dovetails neatly with something that Rick put in the chat about Supervisor Marr and, next up, Connie Chan and Dean Preston. I absolutely think that Rick is spot on here, and that these super PACs like Grow SF are absolutely going to target Supervisor Chan and Supervisor Preston. I think they've made it clear that that's what they're going to do in the 2024 cycle. So I am less worried about those folks being recalled, given how close we are to the election, and more worried about figuring out how to make sure that the billionaires don't force them out of office after their first term, the way they did with Supervisor Marr. But as far as your question, I think, recall, we should have recall reform. It should be harder to recall people. I think there should be limits on how much, out of state money. I think paid signature gathering is probably inherently problematic. I think there should be more transparency in where the money's coming from. I think people should have at least a year in office before they're allowed to be recalled. They started recalling DA Gascon in LA within 3 months of his inauguration. I mean, it's crazy. He just got elected. You may not have agreed with his election, you may have voted against him, but it used to be you had 4 years to do the job, and if you did a bad job, you get voted out. Now they're not even giving him 90 days before they start making him focus on political campaigning. It's a hard enough job to do when you can full time on the job, but you add in this kind of constant campaigning and fundraising, and it really, no coincidence, not an accident, makes it impossible. So I think recall reform at the local and state level are important. And then I think making sure we have credible sources of information that can rebut the kind of onslaught of disinformation. Places, I think someone mentioned 48 Hills, Mission Local. We really need, independent, honest, non-corporate owned media to keep people informed, because there was so much disinformation that led to and made possible my recall. And once that narrative is set, it's very, very, it's just very difficult to break through.
Chessa,
I just would like to
go. I'm sorry. Chessa said he had a hard leave at 2:45, and it's after that now. Chessa, you're limited by your time, or
I am. I'm sorry to say, I've got to be somewhere on the other side of the city. So I know Zoom
Okay.
makes it easy, but I'm at my home office and I've got to be on the other side of the city. So
okay. Thank you very much for speaking to us today.
thanks,
And-
Art. Appreciate you all, and look forward to continuing the conversation and the work in solidarity.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. And I'm sorry, Rick and Diane.